It's really hard to do this and not like be drooling and ready to eat it because it's it's so good. Hi everybody, my name is Maurizio Leo and I'm a sourdough baker. Today we're gonna make focaccia. Super easy process, and since I'm using my sourdough starter, we're gonna do a long fermentation time and it brings a lot of flavor to one of my favorite breads. One of the things that I think makes focaccia so great is typically you'll find that it has a really high hydration. So that means there's a lot of water to the amount of flour that you're using, and that can be hard to mix by hand. So one of the great things about having a spiral mixer is that we can do it fast and efficiently. Here I already have my flour mix of all-purpose and bread flour. It gives you a good amount of structure from the high protein flour, and the all-purpose flour, the medium protein flour, gives you that tender, chewy interior. So I have my two flours in the mixing bowl, and now I'm gonna add my sourdough starter. It's really bubbly, really active. It smells a little bit sour, and what I like to say is that it's ripe and ready to be used. Now I like to put it into the mixer. Since this dough has such a high hydration, I like to hold back quite a bit of the water until we get this mixed together, and then we'll add it in through stages as we see the dough develop during mixing. So we're gonna turn the mixer on to low speed to get initial incorporation. We'll start it off slow, maybe 20 to 25%, and then we'll take it up from there. So I'm seeing the flour start to hydrate, the dough's starting to come together. I don't want to add too much water at the start. That's why I'm holding back this little amount in here, and we'll add it as mixing continues. Okay, so now that the flour's all hydrated, I'm gonna turn the speed up to 45, set a timer for 3 minutes, and then I'm just gonna let the mixer do its thing and come back when that's done. Okay, so we're getting near the end of the first 3 minutes of mixing. In a really short amount of time, we can already see the dough is really starting to strengthen up. We're getting some defined edges and it's pulling cleanly from the bowl. One of the really amazing things about using a spiral mixer is that this happens in a really short amount of time. Normally it would take many minutes in a planetary or mixing this by hand. Now that we're done with the first phase of mixing, we're gonna set a timer for 5 minutes. And that lets the dough kind of relax, lets the gluten relax a little bit. That way when we come back to add the salt and more water, we can really push the hydration of this dough and avoid over-hydrating and under-mixing the dough. Okay, it's been 5 minutes. The dough in the mixing bowl is relaxed out. So now we're gonna proceed with adding the salt and some more water, and we're gonna try to increase the hydration as mixing progresses. Another reason I like to hold back some of the mixing water is you really want to dissolve the salt just a little bit so that it evenly covers through the dough. Otherwise you might find pockets of salt. This just helps get it smoothly and evenly incorporated. And this spiral mixer is really good at evenly distributing the ingredients through the dough. So even though the salt is on top right now, as we gently mix it, it's going to get all of the salt evenly distributed throughout. And it really helps that we can turn the mixer on to a really low speed because that avoids the salt kind of tearing apart the dough if it goes in at too high of a mixing speed. So we'll start off really slow. After we add the salt, the dough will kind of break apart a little bit, and I think a lot of bakers get worried at this point because they're like, oh, I just strengthened the dough and it was all nice and smooth and now it's breaking apart, but this is totally normal. It usually takes just a few moments. Salt has a real tightening effect on the dough, and that helps bring it back together. The dough is already looking pretty smooth. There's a lot of shagginess to it, but starting to see some of the elasticity build up, some of the strength. Now that the salt is in the dough and it has really come back together, I can set a timer for 4 minutes, and then I'll come back and check when it's done. The timer went off, it's been 4 minutes, and I always like to give a last minute check on the dough and just kind of assess the strength, the hydration levels. And this is really a beautiful dough. You can see how strong it is. It feels exactly where I want it to be for a focaccia. We almost have a window pane, which is really what we look for in a fully developed dough. So let's turn the mixer on, and we're gonna slowly stream the water in. We're gonna use the water spout here on the top lid, which really helps get the water in the right spot in the mixer and only at a certain pace, which is nice because I can see the effect of the water as it's going in, and I add a little bit more when I see that it can take it. At this stage of mixing, I think it's really the most important part of the process. We're trying to get the water level and the hydration to the right point. This is where we're really developing that baker's intuition that I talk about often. So I can see here in the dough It's all now absorbed, so I want to add a little bit more. And this is kind of an iterative process at this point. We need a little bit of patience. We have to work with the mixer as it's doing its job, and we're adding water in stages. Here's a good point to stop and kind of take a look at the dough. You can see that there's really defined edges. There's still a little bit of shagginess to it, which is fine. We're still working on the dough and developing it. I wet my hand and reach in. You can see how the dough is really starting to kind of resist my pull. There's a lot of elasticity that's being built up as the gluten continues to develop. And one of the great things about this mixer is that breaker bar in there. As we're mixing at this stage, it has a tendency to kind of cling to the hook. So without the breaker bar, we might have to get in there and scrape it down often, but now it's keeping the dough off the hook so that we're evenly incorporating and strengthening all of the dough at once. You can see how clean the dough comes off the bowl. This is a good sign that we've got good gluten development in the dough, and we're just about ready to add the olive oil at the end. If the dough was under-strengthened or we were just beginning mixing, it would leave streaks of dough in the bottom, or we'd get the dough that would kind of shred apart. But here we're getting a nice clean removal from the bowl, so these are all good signs that we're almost to the end of mixing. Okay, so now we have the dough at the right hydration level. I like to add the olive oil at the very end of mixing after we've developed the gluten in the dough, because olive oil is a fat which prevents gluten formation. And when you add any fat to a dough, it softens it. And that's part of what we're looking for in the end product for focaccia, is we want that soft and tender interior. The other thing is that when I'm adding the olive oil through this little spout on the lid, it really helps to get the liquids right down into the middle, right at that breaker bar where the dough is kind of coming off of the hook, and that helps get an even distribution of the olive oil throughout. And I like to start the mixer at a lower speed when I start adding the olive oil, but eventually throughout I'll kind of crank it up just a little bit so that we kind of whip the olive oil into the dough. And that's something that, again, the breaker bar really helps to keep that dough off so we can get that even ingredient incorporation. So when I look in here, I can see the dough is really, really smooth. It's at the right stage for adding the olive oil because the gluten has been developed far enough. And so we'll add it in very slowly. And now that the olive oil is starting to work its way into the dough, I'm going to turn the speed back up to 45, and I'm going to start adding a little bit more. Normally, if you were mixing this dough by hand and you're at this stage, it's really a cumbersome part of the process because oil, it's hard to thoroughly mix it through the dough, whereas a mechanical mixer like this, especially with the breaker bar, it really gets that olive oil into the dough evenly and very quickly. It looks incredibly smooth, really strong. This is what I want to see at the end of mixing my focaccia dough. I don't want to see like a sloppy batter. I'm looking for a strong, cohesive dough, and that tells me that the final focaccia is going to have a nice tall rise and we'll get a nice bubbly surface on top. Okay, so we have the olive oil in and the dough is looking really smooth, and I'm gonna make the call that I think the gluten is developed far enough and we're done mixing. You might have noticed that I didn't use all of the water. That's the judgment call that I'm always trying to tell bakers about near the end of mixing, is that you need to decide when you need to call it. Sometimes the flour can't take as much water as the recipe might state. It might be really humid that day, so there's always that intuitive judgment call that you need to make. It's good to hold back that water so that you have the option to not add it all in if it looks like the dough is a little bit too wet or not able to take it. Now that we're done mixing, we're going to transfer the dough from the mixer into this bulk fermentation container. I like to just lightly oil this one, just a little bit on the bottom. That helps when we remove the dough later. One of the nice things about this spiral mixer is that we can actually take the bowl right out, and that makes transferring the dough from the mixer to this container super easy. This is a really high hydration dough, so it's usually really, really wet, really sloppy, but we developed it so well in the mixer that it comes out super clean. And you can see it's super elastic. We've got really, really nice gluten development in there. This is exactly what I want to see at this stage. And keep in mind, this is a really, really high hydration dough with olive oil, so it's impressive that we're able to get this level of development so quickly. Now that we have the dough in the bulk fermentation container, we're going to set a timer for 30 minutes. We'll cover it and we'll come back and give it that first set. Okay, so we're 30 minutes into the dough's first rise or bulk fermentation. And what I like to do is give it a series of stretches and folds. Using the spiral mixer, we got a really good start on developing the dough, but this helps to just continue that as the dough is rising. And it also gives us an opportunity to really just check in with the dough, make sure that fermentation's on schedule, things aren't too cold, things aren't too warm. It's a great point just to kind of step in and see how it's progressing. So with the dough, we can see that we've got really defined edges, which is a great sign that there's strength in it. And sometimes I even like to kind of pull on it and check the elasticity and extensibility. Also really important here is that the dough is relaxed in the container. It's kind of moved out to the sides. And that tells me it's time that we need to give it stretches and folds to kind of bring it back together and give it more strength. So I like to dip my hand in some water just to make sure that it's not sticking. And already in just 30 minutes, I can feel fermentation beginning. The dough is puffy. There's even some air bubbles. And reaching down and giving it a stretch up and a fold over. And then I like to rotate the container so we can get all 4 sides of the dough. And I can feel the strength in this dough. So it's really only gonna need this one set. If the dough felt really slack, really extensible for you, you could give it a second set. And since we did such a good job up front mixing in the spiral mixer, we have less intervention that's needed later in the process. So it's already strong enough, so this one set of stretches and folds will be sufficient to take it all the way till we divide the dough. So after those stretches and folds, I like to kind of gather the dough up in a container, just so we have a nice smooth top to it, and that'll help us see how much rise we have in the dough at the end of bulk fermentation, and it helps us gauge when it's time to actually divide the dough. So now that I'm done, I'll grab the lid, cover the dough, and we'll leave the dough for 2.5 hours for the remainder of bulk fermentation, and then we'll come back and check on it, and it should be ready for dividing. Okay, the focaccia dough has bulk fermented, so we're gonna divide it in half and put it into 2 pans for the final proof. Here I have 2 of the Ooni Detroit pans, and I love these pans for focaccia because the tapered sides actually makes baking them a little bit easier. You get a nice crust around the outside as the heat kind of goes inside. First, what we'll do is we'll oil the bottoms. Oiling the bottom of the pan gives it an even crispier crust than you would if you didn't, and helps to make sure that it doesn't stick. I always like to be a little bit generous with the oil in the pan at the bottom. It never hurts to have a little extra olive oil. These pans are really good, ensuring that the focaccia dough doesn't stick, but just in case. Now we'll grab the focaccia dough. It's risen up probably about 50% during that time. And I always like to have a little bowl of water nearby. I'll use that if I need to get my hands wet to make sure that it doesn't stick. We're just gonna simply divide it in half. We're gonna do our best to get even amount of dough in each pan. Instead of using flour on the work surface to keep it non-stick, I like to use just a little bit of water. We don't really want raw flour at this point since we have oiled pans. It just ends up getting a little bit gummy on the bottom, so water I think is a better choice. And I usually just wet my hand and just wipe down the surface a little bit. You could use olive oil here if you wanted to. I think water is a little bit easier to clean up. We have our bench scraper, and we're just gonna help the dough come out of the container. You can see the dough is really coming out of the container pretty clean here, and that gives us a good sign that we really did a good job strengthening the gluten in the mixer and through stretches and folds. So you can see the container is super clean, it came out nice and easy. So now we have really just a square of dough here. I'm gonna wet my hand again when I divide it and do my best to go roughly in half. It's okay if one focaccia is a little bigger than the other. The easiest way to transfer the dough over to the pan is to really think about like making your hands flat on the bottom, and you're just gonna lift it up and transfer it over. So I'll wet both hands. Just drop it right in the middle of the pan. At this point, there's really no need to be aggressive with pressing it out. We still have several hours in proofing, and the dough is really gonna relax and kind of spread out on its own. I just like to help it out a little bit to get started. And we also don't really want to degas the dough here. Part of the amazing thing about focaccia is that open and light, airy interior. So we don't want to be too rough with it at this point. And that's another thing I love about this dough is that it's super easy. There's no complicated shaping. All we do is divide and put it in pans and then let it finish proofing. After we've finished pressing the dough out just a little bit, we're going to use these lids to cover the dough. And since we have 2 pans here, if you wanted to, you could leave both out for about 3 to 4 hours to final proof, and then we'll bake them. Or you could put one of these in the fridge and you could bake it the next day or even the day after. So it's pretty flexible with this dough. So after they're covered, we'll check back in with these in about 4 hours. Our focaccia dough has been rising for a few hours now, and it's ready to go on to the next stages. The natural fermentation that's been happening for a couple hours is really evident with these large bubbles. The amount of rise that we see, the smoothness. This is the kind of site that I love seeing. It's gonna be the perfect canvas for any ingredients you have. And this is really one of the most fun parts of the whole process, is that we're actually getting our hands into the dough, spreading it out. We're making pockets for the oil and some of the ingredients that we have ready to kind of settle into. And it really just increases the texture and the enjoyment of eating a focaccia. So the first step, we're gonna get our fingers wet so that the dough doesn't stick. And when we go in, we're just gonna push in really far into the dough. Look how soft and well fermented this dough is, and the strength is really evident in how high it's risen. I think a lot of people are a little bit too light-handed with this, but you really want to go in all the way to the bottom. And so we've got tomatoes and olives kind of mixed together, and I love to just push these in down into the dough, and I think it just creates a really beautiful landscape. I can remember trips back to Italy when I was a kid, and I would help my aunts and my uncles prepare these focaccia. We'd often use olives and tomatoes. Sometimes we'd have potato, local meat that we had. They're just classic flavor combinations that you get, and it's part of my heritage, how I grew up, and well, they're just delicious. It really helps to push these ingredients pretty far into the dough. As it bakes and the dough rises, everything's gonna kind of come up together. I don't think you can ever go wrong with too many tomatoes, too many olives. And so the next step is I like to add the olive oil over the top. And this is another thing where we don't want to be too light or too sparse with the olive oil, because this is really what makes focaccia amazing, is the flavor of the olive oil mixed in with all the other ingredients. Okay, and then I like to finish it with chopped rosemary, which I think belongs in any Italian dish, really. And then on top of that, I'll add some flaky sea salt. This dough, actually, when I mix it up, I keep the salt level pretty low because I'm preferring to have these pops of flavor from the salt right on top. This is the kind of like finishing salt that you want to use to really highlight all the flavors that are in the dough and also the ingredients. So now that we have all the ingredients on top of the dough, we're going to bake it for 30 to 40 minutes until the top is really golden brown, and we're gonna see just how much fermentation activity is in the dough. It's gonna really spring up. We'll get a lot of amazing bubbles, and the texture should be really open, light, and airy. All right, here it is. This is exactly what I'm looking for with my focaccia. Some darker areas, some lighter areas. The aroma in here, I wish you could smell it because it's absolutely incredible. I love all the bubbles, the kind of texture differences you see. There's the soft areas where the ingredients are, and I love the crunchy bits that kind of rise up from fermentation. One thing you'll often see in Italy after you bake focaccia is that you add a little bit more olive oil. So I like to just drizzle a little bit on the top. This keeps it a little bit more moist and a little pop of flavor too. All right, now that the focaccia is cool, we're gonna tip it out of the pan. The Ooni Detroit pan really helps set a nice crust on the focaccia. It has a really nice color, and I can feel the crunchiness, and that's gonna contrast super nice with the fluffy interior. So now we'll let the focaccia cool for a few minutes, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm super excited to cut in and taste this. I know it's gonna be absolutely delicious. All right, the focaccia has rested for 30 minutes. It's nice and cool. I transferred it over to the cutting board, and now we get to cut in and have a taste. So this is the kind of interior that I expect to see with the focaccia. There's a lot of fermentation bubbles that have occurred through the long rise that we gave this dough. And thanks to the mixer and the strengthening that we did with the dough, that kind of encourages that open, light, and airy interior. You can see just how soft the inside is. I just love that about this bread. It's such a flavorful bread, and it's really just the perfect balance of texture and flavor. So now I'm gonna continue cutting this, and we're gonna have a taste. I think this is probably my favorite bite of the whole focaccia. You get the really crunchy and crispy corner, and you can see how the olives and some of the tomatoes are down in the middle. pushing them in before we baked it is really what gives you that, so that each bite you get kind of a mix of the soft interior, the crunchy crust, and the tomato or the olive. It's like the perfect bite. You get the textures, the crunchy crust, super soft interior. I love the pop from the sea salt that you get and the olive oil. I hope you love this as much as I do. I love that. That's so good.